Welcome back to Law and Crime Live. I'm your host, Caroline Polisi, and a special welcome to our Sirius XM radio listeners. We are covering the horrendous case of Michigan versus Jeffrey Willis, and that trial is going to get started soon. We will take you live to the courtroom just as it does. Remember, this is Willis's second murder trial. We covered the first trial here on the network last November when he was convicted in the murder of Rebecca Bletch. Well, he's now facing trial for the murder of Jessica Haringa, who went missing in 2013, and he's awaiting trial for the kidnapping of a teenager. We just heard some testimony about that kidnapping there from a Dawn Schmidt. She was just on the stand. These cases are all connected, as you can see. It was the identification by that teenager, Madison Nygaard, who we're going to hear a little bit more from soon, that led to sort of the opening up of this entire investigation and led to really the identification of Willis as the potential defendant in the Rebecca Bletch and Jessica Haringa trial. When the teen was able to escape from that infamous silver van we've heard so much about in this case, she led investigators to a positive identification of Willis. Now, during the trial of Rebecca Bletch, remember, the motive put forth in that case was that he wanted to kidnap, rape, and murder her, just like he did to Jessica Haringa. And of course, Jessica Haringa is the trial that we're here in now. Well, now the prosecution has got to prove this case, but guess what? There's no body. Wow. Another investigating twist here is that Willis's cousin, Kevin Blum, he told the lead investigators that he could lead them to the body of Jessica Haringa because he had, in fact, helped Willis bury the body. Well, he brought them to the scene where he said it was going to be. Didn't pan out. So that's another element here. So much to talk about in this case. I'm joined on set with Law and Crime trial analyst Misty Marris. Misty, thanks for being with us today.
Oh, thanks, Caroline.
Misty, there is so much going on in this case. I just want to talk a little bit about, so yesterday we saw this identification of this toolbox, okay? A toolbox of these just really horrendous a murder kit, really, toolbox murder kit. Remember, this guy had videos on his computer about other serial killers, perhaps thinking like he wanted to emulate them. There's a photograph you see there. There's handcuffs. There's rope. There was even insulin injections. There was a ball gag. There's the insulin there. A gun, obviously. I mean, this was like, you know, I don't even really know how to describe it. It's actually just sickening. What do you think that did for? Do you think that they can successfully say this guy was just kind of a weird dude into some, you know, maybe off-colored sexual predilections, but not a killer?
I mean, that's going to be a huge challenge for the defense, right, Caroline? Because this was some extremely disturbing evidence to actually see that, and I'm just going to call it a toolkit because I don't know what else to call it, that was recovered from Willis's vehicle. That is disturbing. Now, I think that the defense might have had a better path to making that argument, as you said. Yes, this shows that maybe he had some sexual preferences that aren't mainstream. Yes, maybe you could consider him strange or weird or off color, but not a murderer. Well, I think that's really undercut by the fact that the jury is going to hear about Rebecca Bletch. That's different. The minute that it becomes apparent that the judge is letting in evidence about that prior crime, about Rebecca Bletch and the conviction, that's going to be a tough hurdle for the defense to ever overcome. Now, their focus is likely going to be on the forensics and the fact that you don't have rock-solid forensic evidence here. And with respect to this crime, Jessica Haringa, that's going to be the key to differentiate the two in the jury's mind.
Yes, and let's talk about that. We heard from the DNA expert yesterday. Remember, again, you have to go back to the Rebecca Bletch trial. There was so much DNA evidence in that case linking Willis to that murder. Now, there's not even a body here. I mean, so what did you get yesterday from the DNA?
Well, and Caroline, you bring up such a good point because no body murder cases, always tough.
Right.
Always tough to prove from a prosecutorial perspective. Here you have the added twist of his cousin saying that he assisted with the burial and moving of the body, but then no body was ever found. Right. So that's going to be a big issue in this case. But the forensics, the prosecution in this particular case, as opposed to Rebecca Bletch, needed something in the forensic evidence to link this case, because there's not, to Jessica Haringa, there's no witnesses, there's not a lot else to go on. But the forensics really fell flat.
Yeah, you know what? Let's go to a clip right now of that 911 call from the teen kidnap abductee. She made this terrifying 911 call. It just, really gives you goosebumps. So let's take a listen to that now. All right, that was terrifying 911 recording call of Madison Nygaard. She was a teenager when she was abducted by Jeffrey Willis. Misty, I mean, that is, you talk about not having the forensic evidence in this case. Well, you've got a whole heck of a lot of sort of emotional evidence. I mean, even though obviously this doesn't go to the question of whether or not he committed the crime on Jessica Haringa. I mean, this has got to have an impact on those jurors.
There's no question, Caroline. It's a bone-chilling call to hear that, to hear the fear in her voice, and to know that the prosecution is going to walk the jury through the fact that that 911 call, that victim, is the reason why this Willis is sitting in that defense chair today. That there was all this intertwining linkage between these three crimes, and that's why we're hearing about it in the courtroom. Think about it from a defense attorney perspective. You wanted to keep all of this stuff out because, as you said, Caroline, the point is that they have to prove the case, the prosecution, beyond a reasonable doubt for Jessica Haringa. All of this other evidence, the jury's not going to be able to get over hearing that call.
Right.
The jury's not going to be able to get over seeing that toolkit and its association with Rebecca Bletch. So this is a very tough case for the defense.
No, absolutely. I want to get back to that 911 call for our viewers. I want to take a quick break. We'll be back on the other side. We'll listen to the rest of that harrowing 911 call. Welcome back to Law and Crime Live. I'm Caroline Polisi, and a special welcome to our Sirius XM radio listeners. We are covering a horrendous case out of Michigan. It's the case of Jeffrey Willis. That trial is going to get started very soon. We are going to take you live to that courtroom just as soon as we get a live feed. But until that time, we're going to go over some of the most impactful testimony we've heard so far in this case. Just before the break, I played a short clip of the teenage kidnapping victim from Jeffrey Willis, the alleged victim of Jeffrey Willis. She is the only surviving victim in this case. Of course, Jessica Haringa, not alive anymore, or so the prosecution would have us believe. But there is that lingering question. There is no body. There was a body in the Rebecca Bletch case. Remember, she is the woman who was killed, and her body was found on the side of the road. And last November, Jeffrey Willis was convicted in her murder. Now, the question is whether or not the prosecution can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he is also the murderer of Jessica Haringa. Again, no body. I'm joined on set with Misty Marris. Misty, you just made the great point that no body murder cases are hard.
Very hard, because first of all, there's always the defense of, hey, we don't even know. We cannot with certainty say that this person is dead. Secondly, proving cause of death. All of that information that you get through the autopsy of a body simply is not there. So it's usually quite the hurdle for the prosecution and notoriously hard to prove.
Right. So on top of the fact that there isn't a body, on top of the fact that we don't even really know whether or not she is dead, the prosecution, remember, their case is that she was in fact raped and tortured prior to her death. So we don't have any of the forensics there to show normally, and I hate to get so graphic, but normally you would get a forensic expert up on the stand there talking about the specific wounds inflicted on the body to show just what happened prior to the death. We don't have it.
Absolutely. The forensics make those links. These marks are signatures of this type of crime, this or that. We don't have any of that. So the prosecution's theory of the case is not based on forensic evidence, which is why this is going to be, it's a challenging case, except that we really do have a lot of extraneous evidence that's really playing up on the emotional factor.
Speaking of extraneous evidence that plays upon an emotional factor, let's play our viewers another 911 soundbite of that surviving victim, a teenage victim of Jeffrey Willis. She was abducted by him, and she lived to tell the tale. Here is her 911 call in the midst of her abduction. All right, you were just listening to the harrowing 911 call of Madison Nygaard. She was a teenage victim of Jeffrey Willis, alleged victim, I should say, because he hasn't been brought to trial on that kidnapping charge yet. He is in trial currently for the murder of Jessica Haringa. Now, an interesting issue in this case is, and Misty and I have been talking about it sort of for a while now, there's no body in this case. Guys, guess what? Jessica Haringa's mother believes she's still alive, believes she is still out there. Look at this Facebook post that she posted out to the world. Let's see if we can get that up on our screen here. If we can't, the issue is that there it is. Find Jessica Haringa Facebook post there, and it says on April 26th at 10:13 a.m., today marks 5 years since my daughter was abducted. Please share, and share again to any site you belong to your friends, anyone you can. Please share if you live in the United States or in another country. I will never quit looking for my daughter. The police have. Let's make this the year Jess comes home. She is alive. She is out there somewhere. Someone knows. Be my daughter's hero. No Jess, no justice. Misty. I mean, this is shocking, to say the least, because you would think that if this mother truly believed that her daughter had been abducted and killed by Jeffrey Willis, that she would be full steam ahead with the prosecutors in this case to get him behind bars for her daughter's murder.
No, you're right, Caroline, but there's another factor here, and you'll see, because it's so difficult to read that, you can feel the mother's love and just that hope.
Yes.
In a no-body murder case, the body hasn't been found. There's that dangling hope that perhaps her daughter is alive. And I agree with you. I think the defense may even play up on that. We know that you have something in the public sphere that it's fair game. So even her mother does not think that she's dead. So how can you possibly convict Willis? But the prosecution, again, could address that. It is, with any sort of psychological therapy type of expert, that this mother is really holding out hope, that she doesn't know one way or the other exactly what happened, as none of us do, that we have to follow the evidence that we have, which leads us to Willis. So I agree with you. It's surprising, but I also can see, just from an emotional perspective, she does not want to let go. Yeah. She doesn't want to surrender to what may be the truth.
You're right. You're right. But, you know, if I were prosecutors, I would be jumping all over this. And I think they really have. They're putting forward, you know, playing up this mysterious aspect, you know, and I hate to bring it up, but they are bringing it up that Jessica may have been involved in drugs, that, you know, she led this life that, you know, potentially put her around characters that were nefarious. So the question is, maybe somebody else did it, or maybe she just went off and rode off into the sunset and is hiding somewhere.
And that's what you're going to do, right? To raise that reasonable doubt, because you don't have to prove any of those theories, right?
I meant defense, sorry.
Yes, I knew what you meant. I knew. But you don't have to prove any of those theories as a defense attorney. You don't have to prove an alternate theory.
Right.
All you have to do is present an alternate theory and say that raises reasonable doubt that Willis, you're not proving your case, prosecution, that Willis was the person who committed this crime beyond a reasonable doubt. And you toe a fine line as a defense attorney when you talk about the victim's life and potential conduct that wouldn't be looked upon favorably. For instance, you know, involvement with drugs, involvement with other not seedy characters. Right. But you have to do it carefully. Right. In order to protect your client.
Right. Never a good look as a defense attorney to sort of malign somebody that in all likelihood is deceased. But, you know, I think we've been talking about this on the network too. You know, in light of the opioid epidemic in this country, it's almost not even, you know, defamation per se to bring this up. So many people are touched by drug addiction that it's almost not even, not to belittle it, but it's not that extraordinary, or it's not that, you know, crazy of a thing to have. So many Americans are struggling with addiction.
Absolutely. It's become a little bit less of what once might have been seen as complete deviant behavior to something that's really impacting people all over the country and pulling them down in a downward spiral. So I agree with you, Caroline. There's not the same panache that I might have used to have. And the defense attorneys, I actually think, are doing a pretty good job of presenting those types of factors that could potentially raise reasonable doubt without taking that stance of really defaming or painting the deceased person, the victim in this case, in a poor light.
Right. I mean, Yeah. So again, the prosecutors, they don't have this DNA evidence. They don't have forensic evidence. They don't have a body. So they're pulling out everything that they can. Let me just take you through some of the evidence here that either was proposed in this case or was allowed to come in. One, he had a list of so-called toolbox serial killers, okay? He had a list of those, and he had his own, obviously, we've talked about this perverse toolbox, and we saw the contents of that yesterday. He also had some necrophilia videos on his computer, and he had a folder labeled VIX, short for victims. Well, guess whose name was in that folder? Rebecca Bletch, Jessica Haringa. Pretty disturbing stuff. He also had videos of roadside abductions and assaults of women. Now, the judge did not let those in. How is that not relevant?
Well, you know, the defense is going to make the argument that that isn't relevant to the prosecution's theory of the case with respect to what happened with Jessica Haringa. I'm actually surprised at some of the other evidence that is coming in and the fact that that is the one piece the judge found to be too prejudicial.
Right.
It doesn't really make sense. It's not really following the trend that we saw with some of the evidence that's coming in, which is allowing the prosecution to present this as an intertwined set of crimes.
Right.
And as this is his practice, and that's what you have to show, that this is a pattern in order to get this other type of information in. But I agree with you. The most damaging piece, I believe, in the list of evidence that you just spoke about is that VIX folder. Right. So say everything else aside, the toolbox, which is out of a horror movie, in my view. But the fact that you have the VIX folder coupled with that other information with Jessica Haringa's name, that's a difficult hurdle to overcome.
Very difficult, absolutely. Let's jump again to some more of that harrowing 911 call from the teenage victim in this case. She was abducted, allegedly, by Jeffrey Willis. This is an on-the-ground, live, sort of inside view of what she was going through during that abduction. Take a listen. All right, there it is. You heard it with your own ears. That was Madison Nygaard calling 911 in the midst of her abduction. We saw a little bit of Jeffrey Willis there listening to that call. Pretty nonplussed, I have to say, sometimes taking notes, not looking very moved at all. I'm joined on set with Misty Marris. Misty, just picking back up on what we were talking about before, the inexplicable nature of the judge's rulings in this case in terms of what evidence he is allowing in and what he isn't. I mean, there is so much prejudicial evidence here. He had underwear from his coworker that we know he would continually ask her for. That was allowed in.
Well, that's the shocking part, Caroline. Actually, I completely agree with you. That, to me, if there's an argument for what would be irrelevant to this case, that would actually be it. We don't have a situation where the prosecution is trying to argue that he kept underwear as a trophy in the Jessica Haringa case or anything like that.
Right.
So it seems to be that if there was going to be a piece of evidence excluded, that would be the one. The other stuff that you just read about what was found on his computer, obviously the toolbox, those damaging pieces of evidence, again, the defense could make an argument, theoretically, that these items, while definitely off the beaten path and definitely not the norm, and maybe makes the jury feel uncomfortable, does not mean that he committed murder. That VIX file, that to me, knowing that that exists, why would Jessica Haringa's name be in there if this man has no affiliation with her?
Exactly.
It doesn't make any sense. So there's so many pieces of evidence that are damaging, despite the fact that there aren't forensics. I think when the judge made his ruling that there was going to be testimony and the prosecution was going to be able to talk about Rebecca Bletch and Madison, the kidnapping victim, in this trial, then why exclude some of that other stuff?
Right.
Because that's really the piece of the puzzle that's going to tip the scales.
Right. More probative, even though those videos of these roadside abductions, of the necrophilia, of the just really disgusting stuff, really as like a roadmap of the types of crimes that he wanted to commit. I will say, I should note that, that the underwear of the coworker that was found, that was also, remember, the coworker's gun that actually he had stolen as well. So maybe there's a possible link there. But I mean, it's just really, really disgusting stuff. I want to play the last portion of that 911 call, that very terrifying teen kidnapping victim, the 911 call. All right, that was the 911 call of Madison Nygaard. Remember, she is so key to this case because it is her testimony that led to the identification of Jeffrey Willis. Now, Misty, we're going to hear some direct testimony of Madison Nygaard. She got on the stand in this case. Talk about the sort of strength it takes for a young person of that nature to get up on the stand.
Absolutely. And I look at Madison Nygaard and think to myself, her bravery, the fact that she was able to be so brave to open up that car door and get out of the situation, call 911, and now sit up on the stand and recount this absolutely horrific incident that she endured. It truly is amazing. And her testimony, and we're about to watch it, her testimony is so moving. And remember, her positive identification helped police and investigators to unravel all of this, led to Willis's arrest, and led to the fact that he's now facing prosecution today. So she really did, at the very least, I mean, he's serving a life sentence for Rebecca Bletch. Let's not forget that.
Right.
Took this guy off the streets.
Right. Speaking of, let's go to that testimony of Madison Nygaard on the stand in this case. All right, those were today's top crime stories from our Law and Crime staff. Welcome back live to Law and Crime, and a special welcome to our Sirius XM radio listeners. I'm joined on set with Misty Marris, Law and Crime trial analyst. Misty, before the break, we were listening to this just horrible testimony from Madison Nygaard. She was the teen abductee of Jeffrey Willis. Of course, we're on trial now for Jeffrey Willis potentially being the person who committed a murder against Jessica Haringa. So why are we hearing testimony from Madison Nygaard?
So the prosecution did a pretty good job of establishing the fact that this was a pattern in practice. So that's the key, because obviously the defense is going to say, Madison Nygaard, that has nothing to do with the prosecution's burden of proof with respect to Jessica Haringa. But the prosecution was able to convince the judge that because Willis has this pattern of preying on vulnerable women in these vulnerable situations, abducting them, and we know Madison Nygaard, she said, and then he tried to shoot me. So basically abducting and killing vulnerable women. And that's how this came into the testimony for this particular trial, because we know the Madison Nygaard trial, that's coming down the pike. But her testimony was so compelling, telling her story of what happened to her that night. And Caroline, let's not forget, it was an absolute identification of Willis as her captor. Now, again, the prosecution, they're going to try and lump this all together because they don't really have the forensics with respect to Jessica Haringa. But the defense is going to say, you have to separate it. You have to view these as three separate crimes. But let's be real. A jury hearing that testimony, it doesn't leave your mind. Her sitting on the stand and telling this horrific incident that happened to her, the jury's going to remember that.
Right. You have sort of the world of law and then the real world, right? So in the eyes of the law, jurors should really only hear evidence going to this particular crime and whether it occurred on this particular night against this particular victim. However, we all know that, propensity evidence, as we sort of lawyers call it, it's not supposed to be allowed in, but it's oftentimes the most compelling because the fact is people that commit horrible crimes of this nature, often they don't just do it once.
Right. Okay,
it's a pattern or a practice in their life, and they've exhibited signs of it, like maybe a potential kidnapping, just like this one. And it's very, very impactful for a jury.
Absolutely, and that's why when we were talking about some of the other evidence that we know is going to come into this trial, like the internet searches and information about Rebecca Bletch, that's all going to be something that's in the jury's mind. And again, the way the prosecution gets that in is that pattern and practice argument that this is part of a bigger pattern of what he does to vulnerable women. But really good trial attorneys, absolutely, you got to know the law inside and out, the rules of evidence inside and out. But really good trial attorneys don't forget about the real world.
Right.
And that's why the prosecution's going to push so hard, because they know a juror is going to be thinking in their mind, wow, look at these other two crimes.
Yep.
Well, that's going to be tipping the scale a little bit when you're talking about Jessica Haringa, and it's the defense's job to raise any reasonable doubt and to put a wedge in that argument.
Speaking of the defense, now I am a defense attorney, and I was watching Law&Crime trial analyst Julie Rendelman on here yesterday, I think with Amy Dash, and she was saying the interesting thing here is that the judge is letting in this evidence of the Rebecca Bletch murder when that murder not necessarily so similar to this one. Remember, Jessica Bletch was killed with a gun, and her body was found on the side of the road. Now, there's some similarities, but the question is it so similar that it would go to a modus operandi, sort of this idea? On the other side, the judge is not letting in, just as you mentioned, Misty, some of this sort of computer evidence. And let's just remind our listeners and our viewers just kind of the horrific things that were found in his computer. He had a file labeled VIX for victims, and Rebecca Bletch and Jessica Haringa's names were on that file. He also had a lot of really disturbing videos about serial killing, about necrophilia, things of that nature. Let's also just show what was found. We've been talking a lot about the silver van. Let's talk about what was found, this sort of toolkit, if you will, that was found in Jeffrey Willis's car. I don't know if we have a photograph of what was recovered there, but you can see that this guy had a lot of very disturbing things. I don't know, Misty, can you take us through some of the things that were found?
Oh, I mean, this is, again, I think when I saw this picture, when we saw this evidence, this toolkit full of handcuffs, a ball and gag, rope, you look at this, and remember, the jury sees this, syringes, the gun. This is all going towards that the prosecution's argument that this is what this man had in his car. Much of this evidence that we saw had DNA links to Rebecca Bletch,
yes,
interestingly enough. And I really do think, as far as, and I watched Julie as well, and Julie's a brilliant defense lawyer, and I agree with her. As a defense attorney, I would have fought long and hard to say that there really isn't this link, and this is way too prejudicial to let the Rebecca Bletch information in. And I really think that might have been compelling, but for that VIX folder.
Yeah.
Because if I'm a clever prosecutor, I say, okay, Your Honor, but we have this folder with 2 names in it. And one is Rebecca Bletch.
Right.
And the other is the victim in this case. So in order for the jury to make any sort of conclusion, this is probative evidence that's going to speak to the heart of the crime. So that, I think that's really where maybe the scale was tipped on that particular issue.
I agree with you. Let's go back to that clip of Madison Nygaard. Remember, she was the underage kidnapping victim of Jeffrey Willis. Welcome back to Law and Crime Live. I'm Caroline Polisi, and I'm joined in studio with Misty Marris, our Law and Crime trial analyst. Misty, we're recapping some of the key testimony in the Jeffrey Willis case before we go live to that courtroom there. And we just finished, of course, that horrible testimony from the underage victim, the kidnapping victim, the only surviving victim in this case. But we're about to hear from Jessica Haringa's boyfriend. And he's going to talk about her drug use. Apparently she used heroin, she used marijuana. We heard from a witness yesterday who basically, I mean, she witnessed this abduction, but she didn't do anything because she thought actually that Jessica Haringa was in fact stealing product from the ExxonMobil gas station where she worked with her. So she kind of just sort of laid in wait to watch that. She's also a young mother. There's a photograph on your screen right now with her and her young child. But what do you think testimony regarding sort of her lifestyle is going to do in this case?
I really think it's twofold. So for the defense in a case like this, it's very critical that they make those connections between Jessica and her drug use, that she might be dealing with some unsavory characters, that there might be a reason for her to either skip town, or there may have been a possibility that someone else is responsible for her disappearance. Now, on the other side, and we will see this in the prosecution's direct examination of Jessica Haringa's boyfriend, that they're going to establish she has roots here. Despite the fact that all of this happened, she has a good relationship with family. She was in a relationship. She has a child. That there's no way that she's just going to leave town and disappear into the night. And the defense, as we talked about before, Caroline, they're going to try and use that argument. They're going to say, look, there's not enough evidence here. We don't have a body. We don't have any forensics. There's not enough evidence to say what, if anything, did happen to Jessica? So I think the testimony really does cut both ways, and you're going to see the prosecution and the defense using the same testimony in a different way.
Absolutely, as is often the case in trials like this. So let's listen now to Jessica Ringa's former boyfriend, Dakota Quayle Dreyer, on the stand earlier in this case.